For most people, the ancient world is a gallery of legends. Kings draped in flowing robes, clay tablets etched with strange symbols, gods with animal heads, and ruins cloaked in dust left behind by civilizations that vanished into the sands of time. But buried beneath those stories is a truth that rarely reaches our textbooks, a truth that challenges everything we think we know about history. Before Wall Street, before banks issued loans, before taxes were collected, or the very concept of an economy existed, there were temples. For nearly 2 millennia, the gods of Mesopotamia weren't just worshipped. They were the architects of the first real financial system in human history. They controlled wealth, labor, land, trade, all under the watchful eyes of priests who doubled as the earliest economists, bankers, and bureaucrats. Welcome to the economic empire of the Mesopotamian gods, where faith, power, and money collide, and where nothing is ever as simple as it seems. If you've ever wondered how money, contracts, and credit first came into existence, how wages were measured, trade was organized, and institutions gained authority to run entire cities, you must journey to ancient Mesopotamia. Between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, in lands that now belong to Iraq, Kuwait, and Syria, a civilization rose that historians call the cradle of civilization. Yet it wasn't just civilization that was born there. Something more powerful, more transformative, and far-reaching emerged: the temple economy. It's difficult for us today to truly grasp how intertwined religion and economics were in ancient Mesopotamia. We think of temples as places of prayer, and banks as places of finance, two completely separate worlds. But in the earliest cities like Uruk, Ur-Lagash, Babylon, and Nippur, that boundary simply didn't exist. The temple wasn't merely a house of worship, wasn't a quiet sanctuary where priests whispered invocations under flickering candlelight. It was the central bank, the landlord, the corporation, the employer, the vault, the regulator, and the tax office, all rolled into one colossal institution that towered over the city. This was not a marginal feature of ancient society. This was the ancient society itself. The gods of Mesopotamia could easily be called the world's first Federal Reserve, and the priests were the first financial managers. To understand why temples became economic powerhouses, we must remember how unpredictable and fragmented early city life was. Mesopotamia was not a unified nation. It was not a peaceful tapestry of small villages. It was a patchwork of fiercely independent city-states, constantly competing for scarce resources, trading over vast distances, and vulnerable to floods, droughts, and raiders. There was no central government, no tax bureau, no professional bureaucracy. But the temples. They had everything required for a functioning financial system: vast tracts of land, organized labor, storage facilities, literacy, legitimacy, and most importantly, trust. When people believed that a god governed an institution, compliance became remarkably efficient. Now, picture one of these temples in its full economic glory, not as a ruined pile of bricks today, but as a living, breathing center of production and administration. Imagine Uruk around 3000 BCE. The city's life revolves around the towering ziggurat, a multi-layered structure piercing the skyline. At its pinnacle lies the shrine to the god, but below it pulses the lifeblood of the economy. Priests and scribes traverse courtyards, tablets in hand, documenting the inflow of grain, counting livestock, and recording labor contracts. Massive warehouses store mountains of barley, the currency of the time. Workshops hum with activity: textiles, pottery, metalwork, brewing, and more. Farmers deliver part of their harvest as temple rent. Shepherds bring wool and sheep. Artisans turn copper into tools. Caravans are dispatched for trade missions, financed and authorized by temple administrators. This was far more than religion. It was the earliest form of organized economic life on the planet. Land ownership was the first financial mechanism. Temples held vast territories legally belonging to the gods, but managed by priests. Farmers didn't own their fields. They leased them from the temple and paid rent in grain, labor, or livestock. While this wasn't taxation in the modern sense, functionally it operated in the same way. The temple collected a portion of production and redistributed it to workers, officials, and dependents. From these lands arose a complex labor system. Temples employed thousands: field workers, builders, herders, weavers, potters, brewers, metalworkers, scribes, guards, midwives, and priests. In some cities, temple payrolls overshadowed all other economic actors combined. Compensation came in standardized rations of grain, oil, and beer, carefully measured and meticulously recorded. Early writing, it turns out, was not for storytelling or poetry, but for accounting. The earliest clay tablets are not epic tales, they are receipts. The innovation of temples did not stop at wages. They were also the earliest banks. Warehouses held citywide reserves of grain, silver, and goods. Citizens stored their surplus there because it was secure, protected, and overseen by literate scribes. This naturally led to lending. When crops failed or merchants needed barley for trade, they borrowed from the temple with interest. Paying interest to a god may sound intimidating today, but in a world without credit scores or collateral, divine authority served as the ultimate guarantee. Loans were meticulously documented on clay tablets, specifying quantities, due dates, obligations, and penalties. Some tablets even reveal early forms of compound interest. The temple became the financial hub not because of spiritual power, but because it was the only institution capable of coordinating complex economic activity across thousands of people. Weighing stations within the temple ensured standardized measures, critical for fair trade and accounting. Standardized weights, units, and measures often credited to civilization itself were fundamentally designed to simplify temple accounting. By the mid-3rd millennium BCE, temples functioned like corporations. They financed large-scale irrigation projects requiring coordination across entire regions. They sponsored trade caravans, journeying hundreds of miles into Anatolia, Iran, and the Persian Gulf. They organized labor, redistributed surplus during droughts, and maintained records functioning as legal documents. This was not a religious economy. It was religion as economy. Yet, this system was not flawless. Temples weren't invincible and the priests weren't all-powerful. Power attracts conflict, and surplus invites corruption. Political pressure eventually arrived in the form of kings. These rulers coveted the wealth temples amassed. As temples grew more sophisticated and wealthy, secular leaders inevitably noticed. Kings in ancient Mesopotamia were not absolute rulers. They rose and fell, and their authority relied on legitimacy, which resided in the temples. To govern effectively, rulers needed the gods' approval, or at least the priest's endorsement. Beneath spiritual rhetoric, the need was practical. Kings required access to temple-controlled resources: land, grain, labor, silver, warehouses, and scribes. The financial system, once temple-run, became a target for centralization. Around 2350 BCE, Sargon of Akkad executed a revolutionary strategy. He absorbed temple wealth into the monarchy. By conquering Sumerian cities and commandeering their temple assets, he centralized economic power. His principle was simple: control the temples, control the economy. This shift created a tension that would define Mesopotamian politics for centuries: the struggle between religious, economic power and secular authority. Temples sought autonomy. Kings sought revenue. In a pre-tax society, what we now call public finance was essentially a negotiation over access to offerings, rents, and divine storehouses. Royal debt cancellation emerged as one of the earliest solutions. Whenever debts spiraled, peasants lost land, or inequality threatened stability, kings could issue a clean slate decree, wiping out obligations. This wasn't benevolence. It was pragmatic governance. Too many indebted farmers risked social unrest, loss of soldiers, and decline in resources. Debt forgiveness preserved the system. The parallels to modern financial crises are striking. Systemic threat arises, the state intervenes, debts are reset, and economic life continues. Over centuries, temples and kings developed a complex, uneasy partnership. Temples retained much economic administration, employing scribes who maintained the first bureaucracies, managing redistribution during famine, and coordinating labor-intensive projects like irrigation. They made loans, collected interest, and oversaw citywide commerce. Yet kings gradually captured surplus wealth, controlling trade routes, funding armies, and establishing palace reserves. Mesopotamia did not just invent the first economy, it also demonstrated the first state takeover of an economy. From this evolving system arose the earliest form of the state as we recognize it today. A structure capable of collecting resources, redistributing wealth, regulating trade, recording data, enforcing contracts, all functions inherited directly from the temple economy. Remove the mythology. What remains is a machine. A system built not on belief alone, but on administration, on record-keeping, on labor management, on surplus redistribution. Writing, storage, accounting, and labor became the backbone of civilization itself. Yet the system was fragile. Floods, droughts, invasions, and political fragmentation continually threatened balance. Excessive debt, concentration of wealth, and inequality fueled social unrest and economic collapse. One early example comes from 2200 BCE, at the end of the Akkadian Empire. Drought, over-centralization, and administrative failures triggered famine and social breakdown. Temples could no longer redistribute resources effectively, and kings could not enforce financial fairness. For centuries thereafter, Mesopotamian city-states oscillated between temple dominance and royal dominance, striving to avoid the economic extremes that toppled previous rulers. This story is more than ancient history. It is the foundation of economic organization as we know it. Temple economies gave birth to systems of credit, labor management, and standardized measures. Kings transformed religious wealth into centralized states, showing the interplay between belief, administration, and political power. The early Mesopotamian model demonstrates that economies rely not on abstract markets, but on institutions capable of organizing human activity at scale. Temples did it first, kings did it next, and the principles endure to this day. And this is where the story becomes strikingly relevant today. When we examine our modern financial world, central banks, regulatory bureaucracies, taxation systems, national reserves, infrastructure projects, and legal frameworks, we are not witnessing innovations of the past few centuries. We are looking at an operating system crafted by Mesopotamian temples over 5,000 years ago, refined by kings who sought to harness their power. Temples owning land evolved into governments controlling public property and strategic resources. Temple lending transformed into banking. Temple rations evolved into wages. Temple storage became national grain reserves and strategic stockpiles. Temple accounting laid the foundation for bureaucracy. And temple ideology evolved into political legitimacy. The belief that institutions function because society trusts them to function. The fundamental truth remains unchanged. Economies are not simply markets. They rely on institutions capable of coordinating human activity at scale. Temples did it first. States followed. Corporations operate on the same principles today. Modern economies may appear purely rational, purely numerical, and purely logical. Yet the temple economy reminds us of an uncomfortable reality. Economic power is never just economic. It is cultural, psychological, and ideological. People trusted the temples not because they understood accounting, but because they believed the gods were watching. Today, people trust currencies, governments, banks, and legal systems for the same reason: confidence, legitimacy, narrative. Money in every era depends on belief. So what is the lesson hidden beneath the ruins of Mesopotamian temples? It is simple and unsettling. Financial systems are born inside institutions that fuse power, belief, and administration. Remove the belief, and the system falters. Abuse the power, and it collapses. Lose the discipline of administration, and the economy fails. Ancient Mesopotamia learned this through debt crises, inequality, political instability, and economic resets. Even though the world has changed, the mechanics have not. Today's financial system still rests on the foundations they built. Temples became states, scribes became bureaucrats, grain accounts became balance sheets, ritual became legitimacy, and the system, our system, evolved from there. History doesn't repeat itself, but if we ignore it, it will crush us. If this insight gave you a new perspective on the world, hit subscribe. History is never silent, it has answers waiting, and I'll show you exactly where to find them.